Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back. And as we come to the end of this module, there are a couple of short stories left for you. I hope that it has been as interesting for you as it has been for me. We've done a few short stories in this module, and I'm sure that by the time you come to this stage, your comprehension, your understanding of short stories is that much better. In the previous lecture, I introduced H.G. Wells as a short story writer, and I gave you a very brief introduction regarding some of the sci-fi short stories that H.G. Wells has written. Now, the science fiction of today is the fact of tomorrow. It's the reality of tomorrow. And we have seen with many different things how something is considered fiction, imagination, and then before you know it, it becomes reality and it is accepted. A lot of the things that we read about in literature have actually been made into fact. There were writers who talked about traveling to Mars or to the moon, and we know that man has actually walked on the moon, and we also know that the Mars operation is in progress. So this story is titled The Argonauts of the Air, and because there are 70 plus slides in this, I'm going to go slightly faster with this story. I know I said this in the previous lecture also, but there you had 40 plus slides. Here you have almost the double. The name of the story is a reference to the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and it goes back to Greek mythology. And you know that the Argo or the Argos was the ship that carried Jason and his friends. So giving this story the title of The Argonauts of the Air is very significant, because just as Jason set off on a voyage to explore the world, the same is true of the main characters of this short story, the Argonauts of the Air. So without further ado, let me launch into the text so that you understand what it is that I am talking about. One saw Monson's flying machine from the windows of the trains passing either along the southwestern main line or along the line between Wimbledon and Worcester Park. To be more exact, one saw the huge scaffolding which limited the flight of the apparatus. So straight off, Wells tells you what it is that he's going to be talking about. If the title does not make it clear, then the first sentence that he uses tells you that he's talking about a flying machine. Now remember, Wells is writing in the 19th century. A lot of the things that H.G. Wells wrote about actually came true. And this is one of those things. He's talking about a flying machine back in the 19th century. 20th century, you see the aeroplane developed, and you see how fast the pace of progress was after that. There were different kinds of aeroplanes that were developed. You had the first monoplane, then you had twin engines, and then you saw planes going faster and faster to greater and greater distances possible, until now what they do is that you see those huge planes that transport hundreds of passengers across oceans, across continents. But to come back to the Argonauts of the air, you're talking about Monson, who is an engineer, and his project of the flying machine, which people could see when they were traveling by train, because this is something that he had been working on for a long time, and he had this huge scaffolding that sort of supported the whole plan. They rose over the treetops, a massive alley of interlacing iron and timber, and an enormous web of ropes and tackle extending the best part of 2 miles. So this huge project, it covered about 2 miles, and all that people could see was scaffolding and ropes and cables, etc., etc. From the Leatherhead branch, this alley was foreshortened and in part hidden by hill with willows. But from the main line, one had it in profile, so you could see a side view of this entire project. And what it was a complex tangle of girders and curving bars, very impressive to the excursionists from Portsmouth and Southampton and the west. So it was a very impressive view, because you had about 2 miles of these girders and ropes and this entire scaffolding, which covered a huge area, as he says, almost an area of 2 miles. Monson had taken up the work where Maxim had left it, had gone on at first with an utter contempt for the journalistic wit and ignorance that had irritated and hampered his predecessor, and had spent rather more than half his immense fortune upon his experiments. Now this is a very huge project, and the person who starts it cannot finish it, because journalists came down very hard on him, and they said, you know, he's thinking of flying, and whoever heard of men flying, of human beings flying, and this is just stupidity. So journalists really sort of put the lid on the project. For the first few years, Monson was not worried about journalists, but as time went on, he started to realize that there was something in what the journalists were saying here. Now Monson was a very rich man, and by the time we start this story, we see that he has spent half his fortune, half of his wealth on this project. So after spending half his fortune, after 5 years of starting this project, it is still not complete. What Monson had said was that he would fly over Trafalgar Square. You know, Trafalgar Square is one of the main attractions and tourist spots in London, and what Monson had claimed was that he would bring his flying machine over Trafalgar Square so that the world could see it. 5 years into the project, half his fortune spent, and no sight of him as yet. And every now and again you would see a trainload of season ticket holders, a trainload of train passengers who would see this white monster rush headlong through the airy tracery of guides and bars, and hear the further stays, nettings and buffers snap, creak and groan with the impact of the blow. Then there would be an efflorescence of black-set, white-rimmed faces along the sides of the train, and the morning papers would be neglected for a vigorous discussion of the possibility of flying until the train reached Waterloo and its cargo of season ticket holders dispersed themselves over London. So every now and then they experimented with this flying machine, but it was only within that scaffolding. You'd see this machine rush headlong and then come to a stop. That is not what the public wanted. That's not what Monson had claimed, but that is the stage at which you see the flying machine when the story starts. Or the fathers and mothers in some multitudinous train of weary excursionists returning exhausted from a day of rest by the sea would find the dark fabric standing out against the evening sky useful in diverting some bilious child from its introspection. So what he's trying to say is that this is something that formed a part of the conversation of holiday trippers, but it wasn't at a stage where they could say that it was actually going to fly. So this huge scaffolding that you had, it was there to entertain people, there for people to make comments on, and every now and then they would say, oh yes, you know, you think he's really going to fly? Do you think it's really possible? They would bring in the old arguments again and again, and then they would just forget about it. So in time, people forgot about what was there. They saw it, and yet they did not see it. It was a great and forcible thing beyond dispute and excellent for conversation. Yet it was but flying in leading strings, and most of those who witnessed it scarcely counted its flight as flying. So these experiments that they were making periodically, they were not considered flying, because this machine was still within the confines of those girders and that elaborate scaffolding. The press every now and then would say something about it, but Monson was not really influenced by that. And yet, even he did not have an idea of the time that it would take to develop this flying machine and actually make it fly. So what Wells is talking about here is that apparently Monson was not impacted by what the journalist said. But you know, on the sly, he had this one person whose name was Romike, and he got him to get the cuttings of all that the newspapers were publishing about the flying machine, and Romike would then submit these cuttings to Monson. And Monson actually read what was said in the newspapers. He pretended not to care, but he did read, and he slowly and gradually, the journalistic attacks seemed to penetrate into this armor that he had put on himself, that he was not going to be affected. Time was when Monson had sent the enterprising journalist, keen after readable matter, empty from his gates. So there was a time when Monson said, I'm not going to give any interview, I'm not available, and the journalist would go back. But when the enterprising journalist ceased from troubling, Monson was anything but satisfied in his heart of hearts. So when the journalist stopped writing about him, Monson realized that there was something wrong. And he kept on working on this project, and he continued to put in hours and hours and days and weeks and months of work into finalizing this project. Now what was happening was that on the one hand it was taking a lot of time, on the other hand it was money that was going into that project and which there was no way of retrieving. And this he realizes only when he is only when he's informed that his money now has been reduced drastically, and that it is no longer hundreds of thousands in the bank but tens of thousands only. So from hundreds of thousands he's come down to tens of thousands. And comes the day when they celebrate or when they observe this 5-year anniversary, and that's when Monson realizes that they have been at it for a very long time. He discusses this with the engineer or with the person who's working on the project, and whose name is Woodhouse. And he tells Woodhouse that it has taken a very long time, and Woodhouse tries to sort of convince him and console him by saying there's only going to be 1 more year and the flying machine will be ready. But that year is going to be a very long one for Monson. And so when he talks about one of the parts of the flying machine, Woodhouse says that, you know, if we give the workers more money, it will take 3 weeks to make this. And Monson gets very angry and he says that 3 weeks is a very long time. And at last, it seems as if what the journalists have been saying actually gets to Monson, and he says, how long have they been calling this Monson's folly? And Woodhouse says, only about a year or so. So that is something that stays in Monson's mind, and which gives him a bad temper. And it not only gives him a bad temper, but his bad temper then is reflected in the lives and temperaments of all those who are working under him on this project or who are otherwise affected. And I'll tell you how. Monson's temperament is affected. He becomes bad-tempered, he becomes short-tempered. Because Monson's temperament is affected, Woodhouse becomes bad-tempered. When Woodhouse becomes bad-tempered, it has a kind of what is called trickle-down effect. The man at the top is Monson, under him is Woodhouse, under Woodhouse are the different workers, the different sort of heads of sections dealing with this. And at the bottom, the base becomes very wide, and it includes even servants at the different houses that Monson has, and even they start being bad-tempered, because that bad-tempered has sort of trickled down to all the different people who are concerned with Monson and with the flying machine, either directly or indirectly. So he says, I've started, I've made my bed, and I've got to lie on it. I can't go back, I'll see it through. I'll spend every penny I have and every penny I can borrow. But I tell you, Woodhouse, I am sick of this. If I had paid a 10th part of the money towards some political greaser's expenses, I would have been a baronet before this. So he is so angry that he vents his anger out on Woodhouse. Now Woodhouse is the only person he can actually vent his anger on, because Woodhouse works directly under him. So Monson is, getting tired of the journalists attacking his project and calling it Monson's folly. So he gets into a bad temper. Woodhouse gets into a bad temper. You see that bad temper or that mood is reflected in the character and temperament of the foreman. It's reflected in the character and temperament of all those who were associated with Monson. So the general public starts to feel Monson's temper. People who are working in his house, people who are otherwise associated with him also feel the trickle-down effect. In fact, it goes so far that Wells says that a workman's wife, and this is referring to the workman on this project of the flying machine. So a workman's wife, for instance, whom Monson had never met, decided to keep her money in the savings bank instead of buying a velveteen dress. So fast is that the impact of the bad temper trickling down, that a workman's wife starts thinking, this whole project might come to an end very soon, and therefore I should not buy this new dress, but instead should save the money. And this is where H.G. Wells as omniscient narrator comes in, and he says, so far-reaching are even the casual curses of a millionaire. The millionaire probably doesn't realize how far-reaching that effect is, how many waves he creates in that small river when he thinks he's making a ripple, because a ripple on the surface of the water then extends, it goes far and wide. So that is how far it affected Monson's workers, and even, as he says, his house steward at Cheam. And the immediate cause of it all, now what was it that had actually caused this? What had actually caused it, Wells says, were half a dozen ill-considered remarks made by a pretty girl, prettily dressed, with a beautiful voice and something more than prettiness in her soft eyes. So this is a girl who has made these remarks, and that sort of triggers off Monson. And when it triggers off Monson's bad temper, that impact is felt right down to the people at the base, and those are workers who get their salaries from Monson in that kind of pyramid. So two words she had used especially which cause him pain and which cause him frustration, and that is Monson's folly. She had been very charming to Monson, and she thought that she had been very effective, but she didn't realize how she had triggered off that chain of that chain reaction in Monson and in this project that he is doing. What she had actually asked was, how are you getting on with your flying machine? And this had made Monson really, really mad. But the bitterest thing she had said was not meant for Monson's ears. It had been said to Phlox the novelist. And here's what she said. I have been talking to Mr. Monson, and he can think of nothing, positively nothing, but that flying machine of his. Do you know all his workmen call that place of his Monson's folly? He is quite impossible. It is really very, very sad. I always regard him myself in the light of sunken treasure, the lost millionaire, you know. So these are the words that she uses to the novelist. But of course these words are quoted, they are quoted out of context, and particularly so because she's pretty, she is well educated, and she was a typical person in that she didn't know what was involved. All that she knew was that the bridge was not being completed. And she also sort of summarized what the rest of the world was thinking. Everybody was thinking of the same thing. And so Monson is brought to a point where he says, I must fly now. I must fly soon. If it doesn't come off soon, by God, I shall run mad. So he's constantly reminded of the remarks of that pretty little girl, and that girl's voice seems to haunt him. It haunts him to the extent that he calls Woodhouse the very next day, and he says that, okay, we are going to fly. And within 4 weeks of that initial remark that he made on how long have they been calling it Monson's Folly, 4 weeks after this, he stands with Woodhouse, and he's fixed the new propeller, he's got that blade, everything in place. And when he looks down the long avenue between the ropes, he sees red signals, and 2 miles away an anthill of workmen busy altering the first of the run into a rising slope. So he has to launch the flying machine high into the air. And Woodhouse says, you know, it's foolhardy, we need at least 1 more year before we can say that this project is over and it is complete. And Monson says, I will not give you 1 year. I have given you enough years, and this flying machine should have been flying by now. So at the last minute they have this argument where Woodhouse says, I need 1 more year, and Monson says, we could have flown last year, you're just trying to make this thing difficult, you're just trying to prolong this, and we're going to fly now no matter what happens. Woodhouse of course keeps on saying that they should not take that risk, and that the new steering needs to have work done on it. Monson's argument to that is that if it steers here, right here, it will steer right across England, and so there is no problem in launching this flying machine. And then Woodhouse says, what's the hurry? And to that Monson says, the money. You know, Woodhouse doesn't seem to think how much this is costing Monson, and this is true when Woodhouse says, I never thought of the money. And so he says, okay, we'll do it, we can do it, trust me. So they both turn to the apparatus, and they take a look at this monstrous thing that they have made. They take a look at this screw that they have, this huge screw behind in the place of the tail that they had that they had been working on, and so they look at the machine from all possible angles. And Wells says that the body of the machine was small, almost cylindrical and pointed. So this is where he comes to describing the actual machine. What he had been discussing so far is that entire paraphernalia where the machine nestles and which sort of supports the machine. So there were 2 small petroleum engines for this crew. The navigators sat deep in a canoe-like recess. The foremost one would be steering, and the one at the back would be the passenger. Okay, so this is how this machine works. He says the wings worked rigidly, and this is where Wells inserts a wealth of detail so that you can visualize that machine. And you have to remember that Wells is doing this at a time when he has no data available as to what the airplane will actually look like. This machine, Wells tells us that it wasn't designed to hover, it couldn't flutter, it could just fly. It could go up and down, it could fly, but it could not hover. And Monson's idea was to get into the air with the initial rush of the apparatus and then to skim, much as a playing card may be skimmed. That is, just barely touching the surface. Rooks and gulls, he says, fly enormous distances in that way and with scarcely a perceptible movement of the wing. So he's all for skimming, and he says that gulls and rooks do not fly, they skim the surface. Okay, and then he gives a little detail about birds because it's flying, so obviously you bring in birds, and then he says birds have this plus point, humans do not. For birds it is natural, for humans it is artificial. Birds, from the moment they are born, they are trained to fly, and that is not the case with humans who have to learn everything, and they have to learn with infinite labor and infinite danger. So he says that this flying machine is ready to take off. It's going to be costly, but it's going to be very effective. And of course Woodhouse and Monson are the ones who know how effective this is going to be. Now this is one of those stories where H.G. Wells brings in not only the omniscient narrator who is looking at everything from a very objective point of view, and then he brings in the viewpoint of the different characters. And that's what you see in this slide, where he says they knew they were in the front rank of the coming army, yet there is hope even in a forlorn hope. And then he goes on to elaborate onto this, and he says that Monson and Woodhouse were aware that they would be attacked not just physically but verbally also. And so they stand here and they discuss the possible path that the flying machine will take. And you have to remember that it is not an airplane as yet. It is a flying machine, because this is a work of fiction. You're studying something that was written back in the 19th century, not in the 20th century. So they make a plan for themselves, and then they decide to fly off. Before the day of the start, the newspaper people got wind of the alterations at the northward end of the framework, and Monson was cheered by a decided change in the comments Romike forwarded him. So then when they see this this different work being done, all the newspapers say that, you know, he'll be off one day. So slowly and gradually Monson is gaining the confidence of the general public. And of course everybody kept on saying that, you know, one of these days he's going to take off, one of these days he's going to go and make himself famous. So one bright morning at 10:10 there was a train from Basingstoke that is following, and before you know it, Monson has actually launched this flying machine. Now it has a base and it has a carrier, kind of like you have seen photos of aircraft carriers, huge ships, so huge that an aircraft can land on the deck, which is made out into a landing strip. So they saw the carrier running swiftly along, and instead of stopping where the barrier was, it just shot clean through that barrier, and that was how that was how the first flight began. So this is something that they had seen before. They saw the flying machine shoot forward, but what they had not seen was that instead of stopping at a certain point, the flying machine would clear everything and then go off into the air. So he says that the thing went with a dropping flight through the framework, and it rose again, and then everybody just screamed, because instead of coming to a stop, it goes off into the wide blue yonder, off its 5-year cage, and it goes very, very fast. It not only goes fast, it starts to soar towards Wimbledon Common. It seems to hang in the air, grow small, then it ducks and vanishes over the clustering blue treetops to the east of Coombe Hill, and no one stopped staring and gasping until long after it had disappeared. So it's launched, and people cannot believe that that has happened, because they had become so used to the machine being launched and then stopped when it reached a certain point. So there's this train from Basingstoke coming along at that time, and the passengers from there were just glued to the sides of the windows, and then when the flying machine crossed over, then they rushed to the other side of the window in order to see this flying machine, which could actually fly, Okay, the engine driver and the stoker never took their eyes off the low hills about Wimbledon, and never noticed that they had run clean through Combe and Malden and Rains Park. So what happens to the train is that it's not just the passengers who are looking at this flying machine taking off. It's the engine driver and the one who is stoking the coals into the furnace. So all these people, they are looking at one side and then they're looking at the other side, and then by the time that the driver came back, so the engine driver realizes that he had passed through Combe and Malden and Rains Park because they had been looking at what was happening outside in the skies. So from the moment that Monson had said now, neither he nor Woodhouse had said a word. Both men sat with clenched teeth because of the concentration that the work demanded. None of them had flown that way before. It was a brand new experience for them, and they made a few mistakes. Monson had crossed the line with a curve that was too sharp, and Woodhouse had opened and shut his white lips. So great is their concentration that Woodhouse's lips turn white, and he starts to hyperventilate. He starts to breathe very sharply because, you know, it's an exhilarating experience, it's a scary experience, and the countryside is just rushing by under them. Monson kneels at his post, and his hands tremble on the spoked wheel that moved the wings. This is something that they did not imagine. They did imagine flying, but they didn't imagine flying at such speed that the flying machine could not be controlled. It slants upwards, travels with an enormous speed, and then it starts losing momentum. It's still climbing. The land is vanishing from under it, but it loses momentum. The rate at which it is climbing slow down, and then with a violent effort Monson wrenches the wheel and alters the angle of the wings. Now these are all technical details. It's possible that none of this happened in any of the flying machines or the airplanes that were that were constructed around that time and after that time. What happens is that the machine seems to hang for half a minute motionless in mid-air, and then he sees the houses of Kilburn and Hampstead jump up because, you know, the machine is going haywire. They have difficulty in controlling it, also because they had not planned the path, the flight path of the machine. So when Monson turns the wheel, Woodhouse screams and he says, you know, you've turned it too much. And then Monson brings the wheel halfway back, and the scene keeps on changing. Remember, all this time they're rushing across London, they're turning, and different parts of London seem to be rushing below them. And of course they come too low towards the train platform at Metropolitan District, and the people who are standing there waiting for the train, they just scream because it's like this machine is coming straight at them. But then Monson sort of controls the machine, and they go up again, and they see different scenes. They see the buses, they see the people. Now throughout all this you will see that Monson and Woodhouse have a little problem controlling the machine, and that is because they had not planned on doing it so soon, and therefore they had not seen what possible paths they could take. When they come close to the towers of the Imperial Institute, Woodhouse and Monson realize that if something happens to the machine, it's going to come straight down on all these different places that he talks about. So there is this one fatal second of thought. It's a moment of hesitation when he sees the towers of the Imperial Institute coming up. He thinks, should I clear the towers or should I go from the side? But there's just that 1 second in which he hesitates. He tries to release the right wing, leaves the catch half released, and gives a clutch. He gives a frantic clutch at the wheel. The nose of the machine seems to leap up before him. The wheel presses his hand with irresistible force and jerks itself out of his control. Woodhouse is sitting crouched together, and he says, "You have turned it too far." And then he was clinging to the gunwale for dear life because Monson had been jerked clean overhead and was falling backwards upon him. Remember the time when the wheel jerks itself? That's when Monson, because he has lost control over the steering wheel, he falls backward with the force, and when he falls backward on Woodhouse, both of them fall clean out of the flying machine. And this is something that people in Hyde Park, along Brompton Road, and along Exhibition Road, they saw something falling from the sky, and it's actually these two men. They are thrown out of the flying machine, and they start falling. In the meantime, they see this flying machine, which is a broad spread of flying wings. It sweeps around in a quarter circle, and then it goes eastward, and then it just goes straight up into the air. And when it goes straight up into the air, that's the moment at which Monson loses control of the steering wheel and is thrown backwards onto Woodhouse. And both of them are then thrown clear of the flying machine, and they come falling down. They're separated as they strike the roof of the Students' Club. Their bodies bounce off the roof of the Students' Club and fall into the green bushes on its southward side. Now, when they're falling, the machine is still rising. But very soon after that, people who are watching, and you have to remember that thousands of people are still watching this flying machine. They see a flame spouting, and soon after that flame spouts, the whole thing catches fire, and then it sort of comes down on the solid mass of masonry, which until that time was the Royal College of Science. And so that's how this flying machine comes to an end. That big screw of white and gold, remember, it had been gilded with gold paint. It touches the parapet of the Royal College of Science and it crumples up like wet linen. It had been solid iron, and then the spindle-shaped body smashed and splintered, smashing and splintering in its fall upon the northwestward angle of the building. So the whole mass, it comes down on the buildings of the Royal College of Science. But the crash, the flame of blazing paraffin that shot heavenward from the shattered engines of the machine, the crushed horrors that were found in the garden beyond the students' club, the masses of yellow parapet and red brick that fell headlong into the roadway, the running to and fro of people like ants in a broken anthill, the galloping of fire engines, the gathering of crowds, all these things do not belong to this story, which was written only to tell how the first of all successful flying machines was launched and flew. So let's go back a bit. The crash, the huge flame that shoots heavenward, the broken bodies of Monson and Woodhouse, which fall to the ground, the destruction of the roof and the towers of the Royal College of Science. H.G. Wells says all these things, they do not belong to this story, but these things actually happened. The aim of this story is only to describe and discuss how the first flying machine was constructed, and it's not, I'm sorry, it's not just the first flying machine, it's the first successfully flying machine that is important. The fact that man had actually flown was very, very important. It's something that happened, that's a part of the history of flying, and something that cannot be forgotten. And Wells says, although he failed and failed disastrously because he not only lost the machine, he lost his life. Woodhouse lost his life. In spite of everything, he says that his work is a sufficient monument. It's a monument which will guide the next of that band of gallant experimentalists who would sooner or later master this great problem of flying. Now Woodhouse is writing, H.G. Wells is writing back in the 19th century, and it's in the 20th century that you find a lot of progress being made towards flying. Until now, you have intercontinental flights. You have flights that go across the ocean. The important thing here is to note the contribution of Monson and wood house. And although that huge structure still stands, and tourists see the base for Woodhouse and Monson's work, it is a structure that serves to remind us that all great work that is done has its price. This particular project, that of the flying machine, had a huge price. It had reduced Monson's fortune to nothing. It took away not only Monson's life, but it also took away Woodhouse's life. It destroyed the buildings of the Royal Science College. It created a scare in the minds of the people who watched the bodies of Monson and Woodhouse falling, who watched this flying machine taking off and then burning up. But the fact remains that it's a huge contribution, and it's something that will not be forgotten, because H.G. Wells's idea is that this was just the first successful attempt. This is going to be followed by many more attempts until man can actually master the skies. And between the time that H.G. Wells wrote this story and now, when I am teaching you, you know that there has been rapid and radical progress in the science of flying, so that not only do you have planes flying across continents and across the oceans, but you also have the same planes carrying not just one or two passengers like Monson's flying machine, but carrying hundreds of passengers. There are planes in which you have passengers sitting not just on one level, but on more than one level, and they're called decks, just as you have in a ship. There are planes that are transporting goods, and that are known as transport planes. And then there are machines that have taken human beings into space. Man has landed on the moon. Man is planning to conquer Mars also. There are so many projects that are going on currently, and all of these have their origin in that first flying machine, which came out of the brilliant mind of H.G. Wells when he first wrote about the first successfully launched flying machine. Everything that is happening in the world of aviation and avionics comes under that same head. So this is how H.G. Wells brought in what could only be imagined, and that brings us to the point that I mentioned in the very beginning, and that is that the science fiction of today is the fact, the reality of tomorrow. And nowhere is it proved the way H.G. Wells proves it here, because he's writing in the 19th century, we're sitting in the 21st century, and we have witnessed such rapid change even in our lives. So it's been very interesting teaching you this particular short story. And before I take my leave, let me quickly run through points that we have covered in this short story that was titled Argonauts of the Air, and which I told you is based on the Greek mythological story of Jason and the Argonauts. Except in this case, the Argonauts, those who undertake that journey, are Monson and Woodhouse. It's a very short journey if you look at it in terms of the actual flying time. But when you keep in mind the fact that they were working on it for 5 years, then it becomes a very long journey indeed, and then it can definitely be compared with Jason's quest to travel through the world and explore the world. So the story basically tells the tale of how Monson had started off on this project after Maxim left it, and initially he was not really concerned about what the journalists wrote, although he did keep a record on the sly, yet he didn't allow it to upset him until the term when a very young and pretty girl, very prettily dressed, just mentioned to a novelist that the workers at the site of this flying machine refer to this whole project as Monson's folly, and they don't think that's ever going to take off, because there's this huge structure that they have made, and yet when they experiment, it is only up to a certain point, and when that machine reaches that certain point, it is stopped. And that means that it stays within the confines of that scaffolding that Monson and his friend Woodhouse have made there. It's something that people look at when they're traveling, but which they do not think is going to show anything different for them. And then comes the time when when Monson becomes tired of listening to people's comments, and he actually forces Woodhouse to launch the machine. So Monson and Woodhouse are the two passengers, are the crew of this flying machine. And when they actually fly, people do not believe what is happening, because they've had these test runs so frequently when the machine shoots forward and then comes to a stop. So this time also they think that when it is launched, it's going to come to a stop, and yet it doesn't. It just launches itself out into the air, and the people are wonderstruck. They are shocked to see that it actually flies. But because Monson and Woodhouse have not spent a long time going over what path they will take when they actually fly, they go off into areas where they cannot control the plane, or I should actually be calling it a plane at this moment. It's actually a flying machine that H.G. Wells refers to it as. So this flying machine, they can't control it, and because they're doing it for the first time, and they don't know how to steer the steering wheel, Monson loses control of the steering wheel, and when that happens and the steering wheel sort of jumps out of Monson's hands, it has a sort of impact of recoil, and Monson is thrown backwards on Woodhouse, with the result that the balance of the machine is upset, and this results in Monson and Woodhouse both being thrown out of the flying machine. Now, when they're both thrown out, the balance of the machine is further upset because now the machine is very light. It doesn't have the additional weight of the two people on board, so it just shoots upward vertically, while Monson and Woodhouse fall down. And remember, there's no concept of anything like parachutes at that time. So when they fall down, the machine shoots vertically upwards, it catches fire, and ultimately comes down on the parapet of the Royal College of Science. Now, what A.G. Wells ends the story with is, he says that this was the first successfully launched flying machine. And in spite of the fact that the two men who were responsible for getting this entire project in place die, the machine is lost, yet A.G. Wells says that the seed for making that flying machine has been planted, and one day it will sprout, and when it sprouts and when it grows, then you are going to have flying machines that fly successfully, that don't result in the crew come discoverers, come inventors dying. And what he's actually pointing at is the fact that all the progress that has been made since the publication of the Argonauts of the Air in the 19th century, there's been a lot of progress that's been made, a lot of technology that has progressed until the time when now man has not only conquered the moon, he's also heading towards Mars. There are flights being planned and being organized for points further than that, and something that to us today appears to be a world of fiction will become fact tomorrow. And the tomorrow of A.G. Wells is the today of our generation. What we see today happening makes us imagine what else can happen. And it is when we start to imagine what else can happen and what else can we do that ideas come into our minds. It is through experimentation that we gauge the efficiency of those ideas, and this in turn leads us to experiment with different things, with different items, with different objectives. So science is constant practice. As they say, genius is 99% perspiration, hard work, and only 1% inspiration. So there's a lot of hard work that has gone into the construction of rockets, in the construction of unmanned flights, in the construction of those huge planes that transport human beings and goods across continents and across oceans. So there's from that first flying machine that Monson and Woodhouse made to what you have now, there is an entire world of continual progress, continual hard work. But that is enough for today. This has been a very interesting lecture. You've had 70 plus slides. Some of them I just skimmed through because there was a wealth of detail in those slides, and when you sit down and you prepare for your quizzes, you need to have the whole text with you so that you can make maximum use of it. So thank you for being very patient, and Allah Hafiz.